Short Sale Negotiation, Contracts and Documents, Part 1. Purchase and Sale Agreements. Objectives. These are the objectives of this chapter. Understand the short sale processing documents, know how to arrange a purchase and sale agreement effective for short sales, and comprehend the reasons for needed disclosures. Before we go much further, please consider that in short sales, nothing is either cast in concrete or carved in stone. You have to be flexible. Whether you are an agent or an investor, you will have to follow the same process. In this class, you will learn in great detail the main way to negotiate short sales. With practice, you will develop your own personal manner of doing things. Expect change. It is inevitable. Constantly adapt to your local law, clientele, type of property you work with, as well as present market conditions. Keep learning the business. In real estate, learning is profitable. Develop great contacts. People make things happen. Be patient. It takes time and effort to excel at anything. The best way to explain how to negotiate a short sale is by using a flow chart. To start a short sale, there needs to be a buyer. This will either be a new home buyer or investor. There needs to be a homeowner, who is the seller. Additionally, there can be a listing agent and a buyer's agent. These parties need to be committed to a transaction. This will be reflected in signed documents. These documents are the short sale tools. By far, the most critical document for a short sale is the purchase and sale agreement. This agreement needs to be tailored for short sales. Purchase and sale agreement keys. The contract needs to be used as a negotiation tool. It is important to start from an elevated position that allows you to be able to make concessions. The purchase and sale agreement needs to have built-in exit strategies that allow you to close in more than one way. Most homeowners in default are in financial distress. This fogs their judgment. Sensitive issues need to be managed carefully. Sensitive issue number 1 is the distinction between personal property and real property. This tends to morph into what stays and what doesn't. It is better to have this issue clearly defined. Do not assume what is evident. Not being clear about personal property can lead to depletion of real estate, which is the removal of building components. A good example would be the removal of a chandelier that was bought after the seller moved into the house. The homeowner may feel that the chandelier is just an ornament hanging from the ceiling. In reality, it is a building component. Often homeowners develop an exaggerated perception of the value of appliances. If they want to take anything out of the property, it needs to be established early on and in the contract. Another sensitive issue is possession. Possession is the act of occupying a property. It includes legal rights. Ownership and possession are entirely different. The date of possession needs to be established from the beginning. The contract needs to have incentives for the seller to vacate. It must also provide clauses for payment of legal expenses in case of judicial action. However, because they are amiable transactions, few short sales have possession issues. A huge issue with properties in default is the need to stabilize values. The fact that a loan is in default does not mean that interest stops. A loan current in payments amortizes. A loan in default accrues. Not only that, but other debts secured by the property, such as a second mortgage, taxes, and HOA, are usually also in default and therefore accruing as well. All this interest accruing combined debt grows daily. This makes the debt payoff a moving target. In order to be effective, a contract for short sales needs to provide value stabilization. Another important characteristic of the short sale purchase and sale agreement is safety. Because dealing with properties in foreclosure always involves risk, a short sale purchase and sale agreement needs to have safety contingency clauses and adequate disclosure addendums. Generic agent agreement sample. This is a good example of a generic real estate broker short form purchase and sale agreement. There is absolutely nothing wrong with the agreement itself. However, it does not cover any of the bigger issues associated with short sales. It was not made for it. Since the majority of these types of documents are not oriented for short sales, they need to be modified through addendums. More and more agent associations are having short sale documents and addendums. Short sale purchase and sale agreement. This is a good example of a purchase and sale agreement made for short sales. We are going to complete this agreement. Transaction parties. Here go the contract date, seller name, and the seller's address. In short sales, very often the seller's address is different than the property address, your company name, and/or assignees. This creates a built-in exit strategy. Now the buyer can be changed while the contract remains binding. Property description. County, state, address, and legal description go here. Personal property. In short sales, it's paramount to define what stays and what doesn't. This is a sensitive issue. It is not uncommon for homeowners in financial distress to remove building components such as expensive chandeliers. The contract states the sale shall also include all personal property and fixtures, selecting except names all that goes with the seller, or selecting including means everything that stays with the property. Purchase price. For this example, we are going to use easy round numbers. Earnest money, $1,000. For investors, it's better to use a promissory note. The reason will be evident later. Cash due at closing, $269,000. Total price, $270,000. Now come two important contingencies. It is better if the seller initials them. The agreement reads, sale price not to exceed acceptable lender payoffs as determined by buyer. You do not want someone else later to determine what is an acceptable payoff to you. The agreement continues. Said price is subject to opinion of buyer and/or agent of buyer's choice. You do not want someone else later to determine what is an acceptable price to you. Earnest money. The contract reads, buyer's earnest money shall be held in escrow by agent of buyer's choice. You want to use your favorite escrow or attorney for holding escrow money, not someone else's best choice. Closing. This is one of the most critical parts of a short sales contract. Closing needs to be arranged with negotiation in mind. These are escrow instructions. The contract reads, closing will be held on or about, put a date that gives a long time to close. It is important to have as much time as possible. Some short sales can take a long time. You do not want to run out of contract. The contract should be valid until at least 2 weeks prior to the foreclosure sale date. If needed, it should go beyond the foreclosure sale date, so the contract should have an expiration date that's as far away as possible. At a time and place designated by buyer, buyer shall choose the escrow, title, and/or closing agent. You want to close at your preferred place. The contract continues. Seller agrees to convey title by type of deed needed. In California, a grant deed, a warranty or bargain and sale deed in most other states. Buyer shall pay the following costs in transferring title. You do not want to pay any closing costs. You select seller to pay all seller and buyer's closing costs. The contract continues. The following items you check will not be prorated at closing, and you select all of them, even if it is overkill. Then you check Other and write, there are to be no prorations. By having the seller pay all closing costs and no prorations, the purchase price will be stabilized. Otherwise, the value of the transaction will always be purchase price plus all kinds of variable costs. Remember that in short sales, the owner of the property is overmortgaged and the creditors are discounting. In reality, then, it is the creditors who will be paying for the closing costs. The contract continues. The buyer may extend the closing date an additional 90 days. You want to option yourself to extending the contract in case things get really protracted by paying the seller $500 in cash. No need to put any more than this amount. Buyer reserves the right to do a final walkthrough the day of closing. All kinds of things can happen to a property just prior to sale. By looking at the property just prior to closing, you will ensure you are getting exactly what you are buying. Ideally, you pass by the property on your way to the closing appointment. Possession. It's always better to work with vacant properties because there will be no possession problems. Short sales are amiable transactions. Usually, everything goes well. However, to secure smooth possession, special provisions are needed. This is what this clause covers. Seller shall surrender possession to the property in broom-clean condition and free of all items and debris on or before. A good date to use is the same day as closing day. Enter that date. The final possession date can be changed later. What matters is that the seller surrenders the property promptly. If the property is clean, that would be great. However, to get demanding about this is pointless. Why make it painful for them? The contract continues. In the event possession is not delivered at closing, buyer shall withhold proceeds from sale in the amount of $5,000 as security. Seller shall be liable for damages in the amount of $200 per day for each day the property is occupied beyond possession date. This paragraph shall survive the closing of title. This is because the contract needs to remain binding after closing for it to work if the property is not surrendered the day of closing. If you are selective about clients, none of this will ever be an issue. However, things can happen. That is why we have provisions. In any short payoff, the seller can't get anything at closing. So how can $5,000 be withheld? That is not possible. It is basically a gambit. The aim of withholding this is to present a situation such that if an eviction is needed, the seller will be liable for the legal expenses. An eviction can be very costly. If the seller doesn't want to vacate, the sky can be the limit. An expensive eviction can cost $5,000. The main thing is to use a reasonable amount. If, for example, I put $50,000, that would be excessive and invite all kinds of problems. If for any reason matters end up in court, you want to look fair, not abusive. In addition, to discourage the temptation to remaining at the property, it is important to have the seller liable for damages. By having the seller pay $200 per day for each day the property is occupied beyond the agreed possession date, the seller will be discouraged from wanting to stay any longer. It is only reasonable for the seller to pay by the day for staying any length of time beyond agreement. If the seller does not vacate the property, it can be very costly to the new owner. The new owner is paying mortgage but not using the property. Charging a low amount, such as $5 per day for each day the seller stays at the property, is almost encouraging the seller to stay longer. In most areas, $200 per day is what it would cost for a family to stay in a hotel and store their belongings. The main thing is to be reasonable. An excessive amount, such as $2,000 per day, could be seen as an abusive amount and invite problems. If for any reason matters end up in court, you want to come across as fair, not abusive. Have all the sellers initial this page. Inspection. It is very important to inspect the property as close as possible to the closing date. On your way to signing is the best time. The agreement continues. This agreement is subject to final inspection, on or before, same day as closing date. Access. This is almost a non-issue for agents because there is no listing without access. This is for investors. Buyer shall be entitled access to the property. Required notices. California may be the state with the most investor and foreclosure regulations, so this is a good example. More and more states are having similar legislation. California law is very specific. For example, they even require large font in the notice. For your state's information, look at the foreclosure law link at bestshortsales.com. The contract continues. Notice required by California law. Until your right to cancel this contract has ended, the buyer cannot ask you to sign or have you sign any deed or any other document. You may cancel this contract until midnight of the 5th business day after this agreement is signed. Other provisions. This is a good place for adding anything that is not already in the contract. This rarely gets used. The agreement continues. Other provisions and conditions. See Addendum A. We will soon cover this. A good example of an additional provision is 5% agent commission to Sam Sells of Best Brokers Real Estate. No escrow counter instructions can be in this contract. For example, something such as seller to get paid a certain amount at closing would be an escrow counter instruction as well as a risk. Signatures. It is evident that everyone on the title should sign. Sometimes an additional person other than the husband and wife may be on title. Husband and wife and anyone else must sign. Otherwise, the contract is not binding in any way. Getting back to the flow chart, the next item is earnest money. Earnest money. For an investor doing his own short sale, it is better to use a promissory note. For an agent, it is important to have a buyer with earnest money cash. It is better if this amount is small. A large earnest money deposit becomes a temptation. If for any reason the transaction can't close, a seller in financial distress may feel entitled to it regardless. Names and property information go here. Obligation. The note reads, within 90 days, the undersigned promises to deposit in independent escrow the sum of $1,000 as earnest money. The idea is to not tie up any money and to have a long time to deposit the earnest money. This value needs to match the purchase and sale agreement. As an investor, it is better to not tie up too much money, so $1,000 is more than plenty.